Julia sat in the quiet of her living room, her hands trembling as she stared at the photo of her husband, Mark, holding a young girl she didn't know, someone who looked eerily similar to their own children. Emily, the woman from the hospital, had a secret, and so did Mark. But when Julia uncovered the truth, she realized that the lies he'd been hiding could shatter everything they'd built together. What would she do when the man she trusted most in the world had been living a life she never knew existed? Julia had always considered herself an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. Her days were filled with the usual rhythm of a stay-at-home mom, preparing meals, helping with homework, running errands, and making sure her children were well taken care of. Her husband, Mark, worked long hours at a corporate job, and though his schedule was often hectic, he was always there when it mattered. Or so she thought. Together, they made a picture-perfect family in the eyes of their neighbors and friends. They had a nice home in a suburban neighborhood, and to everyone around them, it seemed like their life was flawless. But recently, Julia had been feeling unwell. It wasn't anything drastic, just a general sense of fatigue and a nagging headache that wouldn't go away. At first, she brushed it off, attributing it to stress. But when the symptoms lingered, she decided it was time to visit the doctor. It had been a while since her last checkup, and she figured it would be a good idea to make sure everything was fine. Mark, always the doting husband, was quick to offer to accompany her to the appointment. But on the morning of her visit, he called to say he had an urgent meeting he couldn't miss. Julia, disappointed but understanding, told him she would go alone. She didn't want to make a fuss over a routine appointment. The hospital was just a short drive from their home, and, though Julia wasn't excited about the visit, she didn't think much of it. Hospitals were always busy, full of the sounds of beeping machines and hurried footsteps. She had been to her fair share of appointments over the years, and it always felt like a chore to sit in the waiting room, flipping through outdated magazines. That day, however, something felt different. The air was thick with tension, as though everyone around her had their own story, their own set of secrets. Julia tried to shake off the odd feeling as she checked in at the reception desk. A nurse, smiling politely as she handed her a clipboard to fill out. She sat down, clutching the clipboard, waiting for her name to be called. Her mind wandered as she looked around the room. A few people sat nearby, some reading, others gazing out the windows. She noticed a woman and child sitting on the far side of the room, their heads bent together as they whispered quietly. The woman appeared to be in her mid-30s, with short brown hair and a calm expression, while the little girl beside her couldn't have been older than 7 or 8. They seemed familiar somehow, but Julia couldn't put a finger on it. The woman's eyes briefly met Julia's, and for a moment there was a strange recognition between them, as though they shared some unspoken connection. The feeling passed quickly, and Julia returned to her waiting, but as the minutes ticked by, her unease grew. It wasn't just the woman and child that bothered her. It was the sensation that something was out of place, something hidden just beneath the surface. She tried to distract herself by reading the magazine in her lap, but her eyes kept drifting back to the woman and child. Was it her imagination, or did the little girl look just like Mark when he was that age? Julia shook her head, laughing at herself for being so paranoid. It was silly. She didn't even know these people. When her name was finally called, Julia stood up and walked toward the nurse, eager to get the appointment over with. But as she passed the woman and child, the little girl looked at her again, this time with a curious intensity. Julia paused for a brief moment, unsure of why the girl's gaze unsettled her so much. She forced a smile and continued down the hallway, trying to brush off the feeling that something was wrong. Little did Julia know that simple visit to the hospital would soon unravel a web of secrets that would shatter the life she thought she knew. After the checkup, Julia felt a strange weight on her shoulders. The doctor had reassured her that everything seemed normal, just a mild case of stress, nothing to be overly concerned about. But the unease that had been building up in her since the moment she first set foot in the hospital didn't dissipate. The encounter with the woman and the little girl kept replaying in her mind. It wasn't just the odd way they looked at her. There was something else, something more unsettling that she couldn't quite articulate. Julia spent the rest of the day trying to put the incident out of her mind, but it lingered like an unwelcome thought. She went about her routine, picking the kids up from school, making dinner and helping them with their homework, but there was an underlying tension she couldn't shake. Mark hadn't come home yet, which wasn't unusual. His job often kept him late into the evenings. They had become accustomed to these long hours apart, and though it was a bit lonely at times, Julia understood. That evening, as she was cleaning up the kitchen, her mind wandered back to the hospital. The woman's face had stayed with her longer than she expected. She had tried to tell herself it was nothing, that it was all a coincidence. But there was a nagging feeling deep inside that something wasn't right. Her mind kept returning to the little girl, her wide, curious eyes. She looked so much like Mark when he was young. Same hair color, same bright eyes. The thought gnawed at her. Was it possible that Mark knew this woman? That he had some kind of history with her, Julia? Hadn't told Mark about the strange encounter yet. She hadn't even mentioned it to anyone. It seemed trivial, a fleeting moment that she should have brushed off. But the more she thought about it, the more it felt like there was something she wasn't seeing. And it wasn't like Julia to ignore her instincts. The next morning, she couldn't resist the urge to dig a little deeper. After dropping the kids off at school, Julia went to the local library. She wasn't sure exactly what she was searching for, but she had a nagging suspicion that she might find some connection between the woman and her family. She sat at a computer terminal, quietly typing in the woman's description in search engines, hoping something might pop up. But nothing did. Frustrated, she left the library and headed home, her mind still racing. She stopped by the coffee shop to grab a cup of coffee, hoping a little caffeine would help clear her head. As she stood in line, she caught sight of something that made her freeze. A magazine cover that had a photo of a familiar face, the woman from the hospital. Julia stared at the picture, her heart pounding in her chest. The magazine was a local publication that featured stories about the people and families in their area, and there, on the cover, was the woman, the one who had looked at her with such intensity. Julia quickly grabbed the magazine and flipped to the story. The headline read, "Local Woman Makes Waves in Charity Work," and the article featured a profile on Emily Grant, a woman who had become involved in a number of local charitable organizations. As she read, Julia's hands began to shake. The article mentioned that Emily was married and had a young daughter. Julia's mind raced. Was this the same woman she had seen at the hospital? The name sounded familiar, but it didn't click until she saw the picture of Emily with her daughter, standing side by side in a photo from one of the charity events. The little girl. She looked just like Mark. Julia's stomach churned as the realization hit her like a wave. This wasn't just some coincidence. There was more to this woman than Julia had first thought, and more to the strange connection she felt. She knew she needed to know the truth. Was Mark hiding something from her? And if so, how deep did the lies run? The nagging feeling that had been building for days was no longer just a suspicion. It was a full-blown realization that something about her life was not what it seemed. Julia's heart raced as she left the coffee shop, her mind now racing with even more questions. What was Mark hiding, and how had she not seen the signs before? She had no answers yet, but she knew she was on the verge of discovering something that would change everything. Julia spent the next few days in a fog of uncertainty and dread. The discovery of Emily's name and photo in the magazine only deepened the unease she had felt at the hospital. It was no longer just a passing curiosity. Something was clearly amiss, and Julia knew it was time to confront whatever truth lay hidden beneath the surface of her seemingly perfect life. Mark, as usual, was absorbed in work, staying late at the office and returning home only to collapse into bed exhausted. He hadn't noticed the change in Julia, her quiet intensity, the way she seemed to withdraw into herself, her thoughts racing every moment he wasn't around. She wasn't sure how to approach him, how to bring up the woman who had shown up in the magazine, or the girl who looked so much like him. Every time she tried to form the words in her mind, she felt a lump rise in her throat, the fear of what she might uncover choking her. She spent hours that week going over the magazine article, rereading every detail about Emily Grant. Julia even made a list of all the events mentioned in the piece: charity galas, fundraisers, community outreach programs, anything that might give her more insight into Emily's life. Julia was determined to piece together a timeline, to understand how this woman and her husband could be connected without Julia ever knowing. It was almost impossible to wrap her mind around it. How could Mark keep such a huge part of his life hidden from her for so long? The more Julia thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about Emily. It was about the life Mark had built on secrets she had been blind to for years. As much as she wanted to believe that she was part of a marriage built on honesty, she couldn't ignore the growing realization that everything she thought she knew about Mark might be a lie. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Julia found herself sitting at the kitchen table staring at the photo of Emily and her daughter. It was so strange. Emily was the kind of woman who seemed to have it all together, the kind of person Julia would have admired if she had ever met her. Yet here she was, part of a hidden chapter of Mark's life that Julia never knew existed. The truth was starting to sink in. Julia didn't want to believe that her husband was capable of such betrayal, but every piece of evidence seemed to point to it. She had spent years trusting him, thinking they were building a life together based on mutual respect and love. But what if that wasn't true? What if he had been living a double life all along? Julia knew she couldn't avoid this any longer. She needed to get answers. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that nothing was wrong. But how could she confront him? How could she bring up this woman, this other family, without sounding like she was imagining things? She needed more proof, more clarity. Determined to uncover the full truth, Julia decided to take a more direct approach. The next day, when Mark left for work, she went to his office and dug through his desk. She knew she was invading his privacy, but at this point, she felt she had no choice. She rifled through the papers on his desk, his drawers, looking for anything: letters, receipts, photographs that might provide the missing pieces of the puzzle, and then, buried under a stack of old papers, she found it, a photograph folded in half. It was a picture of Mark, younger, holding a baby girl in his arms. Julia's heart stopped. The girl in the photo was the same age as Emily's daughter. It was undeniable now. Mark had a child with this woman, a secret child. Her mind reeled. She knew that the moment she confronted Mark, there would be no going back. The truth would spill out, and their entire life together would unravel. She could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her chest as she slowly folded the photo back and placed it carefully in her bag. There was no turning back now. She had found the evidence, and now she had to face the man she thought she knew. Julia's hands trembled as she sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the photograph of Mark holding the young girl in his arms. The image was a silent accusation, a stark reminder that the life she had built with him was not what she thought it was. The child in the picture looked so much like their own daughter, it was almost surreal. Julia couldn't tear her eyes away from the photograph, her mind racing with a million questions she wasn't ready to face. She had never imagined that the man she had loved for so many years, who had stood by her during their toughest moments, who had built a life with her and their children, could have kept such a massive secret. How had she not known? How had Mark hidden this part of his life for so long? There were no answers in the photograph, just more confusion and pain. When Mark came home that evening, Julia had already made up her mind. She had to confront him, had to ask him the questions that had been gnawing at her for days. There was no more avoiding the truth. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when everything she knew was crumbling around her. Mark walked in, looking tired as usual, his briefcase in hand. He smiled when he saw her, but Julia couldn't return the smile. The weight of the photograph was heavy in her hand, and she stood up slowly, as if the ground beneath her had become unstable. "I need to talk to you," Julia said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark's expression shifted slightly, the hint of concern flickering across his face as he set his briefcase down. "Of course," he replied, walking over to her. "What's wrong?" Julia's heart pounded as she held up the photograph. She didn't say a word, just let the image speak for itself. Mark's face froze, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. The silence stretched between them, suffocating and heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. "Where did you find this?" Mark finally asked, his voice low, almost defensive. Julia swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "I found it in your office," she replied, her voice trembling. "Mark, what is this? Who is she?" Mark's face tightened, his eyes darting to the photograph before he quickly looked away. "Julia, it's not what you think," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Julia could hear the lies in his words, and it made her stomach churn. "Not what I think," she repeated, her voice rising now, a mixture of anger and pain in her words. "How could this not be what I think? I've been to the hospital. I've seen her, Emily, and her daughter, and now I find this picture of you with her. Mark, tell me the truth. What's going on?" He took a deep breath, his eyes now filled with something Julia couldn't quite place. Guilt, shame, or maybe both. He ran a hand through his hair and sat down beside her on the bed. "Julia, I didn't want you to find out like this," Mark began, his voice shaky now. "But I owe you the truth." He paused, collecting his thoughts before he continued, his words coming slowly like he was choosing them carefully. Emily is... She's someone I've known for a long time, he said, his voice quiet. Years before we met. We were close. Too close. And we made a mistake. We had a child together. Her name is Lily. Julia's breath caught in her throat as the truth hit her like a blow to the chest. She had suspected, but hearing it from him, hearing him say it out loud, was something she hadn't prepared for. I never meant for it to happen like this, Mark continued, his voice filled with regret. I didn't want you to know. I thought it would be easier to keep it all separate. I didn't want to hurt you. I've been seeing Emily and Lily off and on for years, but I swear to you, Julia, I never wanted to lie to you. I never wanted to lose you. The words felt like a cold knife in her heart. The betrayal cut deeper than she could have imagined, and yet there was something about his tone that made her feel the weight of his remorse. But it wasn't enough. Nothing could take away the hurt she felt. Why didn't you tell me, Mark? Julia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why did you keep this from me for so long? I didn't know how to explain it, he said, his voice breaking. I thought if I kept it hidden, it would all go away. I thought I could be the man you wanted me to be. But I couldn't keep running from the truth. I'm so sorry, Julia. I never meant for you to find out this way. Julia felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. She had never expected this. Never imagined the man she had loved for so many years was capable of such deception. But the truth was undeniable. She was faced with the undeniable reality that the life she thought she knew was built on a lie. And the hardest part was that she had no idea what to do with that knowledge. There was no easy way forward, no quick fix. Julia didn't know if she could ever look at Mark the same way again. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him. But for the first time in days, she knew that at least she had the truth. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, anger, sadness, disbelief, all swirling around inside Julia, demanding to be acknowledged, but never finding a way to be fully expressed. Mark had apologized repeatedly, begged for forgiveness, and assured her that he never wanted to hurt her, that he never meant for things to spiral out of control the way they had. But as the truth began to settle in, Julia felt as if the ground beneath her feet was slowly crumbling, leaving her grasping at whatever she could find to hold on to. The conversations they had over the next few days were painful, often ending in silence. Julia didn't know how to respond to Mark's apologies. She didn't know if she was capable of forgiving him. He had betrayed her, broken her trust in a way that felt irreparable. She had been married to this man for over a decade, shared a life with him, and never suspected that something so significant, so life-altering, had been hidden from her. He had a child with another woman, a secret family that Julia never even suspected existed. One evening, as the house grew quiet and the kids were asleep, Julia sat in the living room, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea. Mark sat across from her, his face filled with guilt, his eyes searching hers for any sign of forgiveness. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Her mind was too full of thoughts that she couldn't untangle. The pain she felt was too raw, too new, and every time she tried to think of a way to move forward, the image of that little girl, the girl who looked so much like her own children, haunted her. "Do you love her?" Julia asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. The question wasn't one she had planned to ask, but it slipped out, a raw, honest inquiry that had been eating at her for days. Mark looked startled, as if he hadn't anticipated her asking it. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you, Julia. I never wanted to be the man who had a second family. I don't know what happened. I was foolish, selfish. But it's always been you and the kids. It's always been you." Julia squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push back the flood of emotion that threatened to spill over. She had spent so many years building her life with Mark, believing in their love, their commitment to each other. But now everything felt tainted. How could she ever look at him the same way again? How could she ever trust him? The image of Emily and Lily was burned into her mind, and it was clear now that they were a part of Mark's life in ways that Julia had never even imagined. The truth was, Julia didn't know what to do. She didn't know if she could stay, if she could forgive him, if they could somehow repair the damage that had been done. She didn't know if she could continue living in a house that had been built on lies. But she also didn't know if she could walk away, leaving behind the man she had shared so much of her life with. He was the father of her children, the person she had trusted more than anyone in the world. How could she just walk away from that? Mark, sensing her struggle, spoke again. "I'll do whatever it takes, Julia. I'll be patient. I know I've lost your trust, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll work every day to prove to you that I love you, that I want to make things right." But Julia wasn't sure if she could believe him anymore. The damage was done, and it felt like the foundation of everything she had known had been shattered. She looked at him for a long moment, her mind racing before she finally stood up. "I don't know what I want," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I need time, Mark. I need time to think." She walked away, retreating to the solitude of their bedroom, leaving Mark behind in the living room. The weight of the decision she had to make hung heavily in the air, and she wasn't ready to make it just yet. She needed to process, to figure out if there was a way to rebuild the trust that had been destroyed, or if it was beyond repair. As she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the photo of her family, she realized that the road ahead would be long, and there were no easy answers. Whether she stayed or left, life would never be the same. The secrets had been revealed, the illusions shattered, and now Julia had to navigate the painful path of figuring out who she was and who she could trust. In a world that no longer felt as certain as it once had,